Hello, everybody. Glad to be a small part of your day. And even better, we get to talk about one of my favorite topics. And hopefully by the end of this, it will be at least in the top 20 of yours. And that's hybrid work. My guess is you've seen a lot about this term recently over the last couple of years for good reason. And in today's session, what I'd like to do is share a little bit about what we've seen at Robin over the last few years, especially go well, not so well, and maybe by the end of this, if I do my job well, you will have a slightly different perspective on what the real goal of hybrid work is. Because spoiler, it's not all about trying to get people back into the office. And we'll talk about that. But first, I got to mind my manners here. So my name's Zach Dunn. I'm one of the co-founders at Robin, where I also head up our customer experience department. What that means is every week I spend time talking to folks in HR, in facilities, in IT, who are trying to introduce flexible workplace strategies to their companies. And we make software that helps them do that. Now, those three groups, we consider workplace owners. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but for the last 8 years, we've been focused on helping facilitate the move from more traditional fixed work to flexible work. For the last 2 years, that's really been synonymous with hybrid work. And well, seems like that's not changing anytime soon, because as many of us started out this journey from the pandemic, we might have viewed work from home and the whole notion of not in the office every day as a perk, as something that was a temporary, hey, let's do this fun little experiment, let's stay at home sometimes, maybe be productive, and then eventually everything's going to go back to normal. And then eventually everyone's going to be in the office 5 days a week. And I think if we learn nothing else, I think we've learned that it's probably the start of a new era in the average office, the average workplace. And with this comes a real challenge. A lot of organizations have designed a lot of their business and culture and management styles around a company that works on the same thing in the same place. And this is one of the big challenges for anyone in a people leadership or department leadership position to help reckon with. And my guess is, given the audience today, you all know how hard it is to make a shift like this without much prior art. There are fortunately not a lot of great examples of, big shifts like this caused by the last 2 years. And so what that means is everyone's doing this for the first time at the same time. And so it can be really scary to know whether or not you're doing it right. And so I consider myself an optimist. So I'm here to tell you, you can do it. And you're probably doing it just fine if you're on this webinar already. But let's try to find a few ways that you can make it even better. So we'll start here. I'm going to start a poll and just basic, let's get to know each other. What tools do you use to connect your hybrid teams? And when I say tools, I mean things like software, the like, because my guess is you've probably had to invest in some extra things in order to make this whole working from home, remote work thing work. And so we'll leave that poll up for a little bit longer, and then we'll get started from there. And yes, video conferencing, of course, is the free space on this bingo card, for sure. But my guess is some of you might have experimented with other stuff out there, and we'll talk about that. So, all right. All right, we have a few more seconds to everybody, so everyone can get their answers in. All right, cool. So good news is that, for the average company, they understand that this is going to be there's no magic bullet. You gotta involve a bunch of different technologies to actually get this done. And the downside, though, is, as much as these tools and the systems that you've introduced, like Zoom, et cetera, digital whiteboards, you name it, they've probably improved some aspect of your hybrid workplace, but about half of the people that you're working with, they understand that there's still room to grow. You're not quite there yet. There are still gaps in people who are choosing to work hybrid remotely versus the in-office experience, and there's room to close that. And so one of the big things to suffer in remote work, a lot of people will go to the relationships with their coworkers, because proximity is a lot easier way to inspire that collaborative energy, that vibrant energy that comes with an office. But when you have these people who are remote, you face a whole slew of new issues. You have people who may not be within driving distance of the office, working with people who are regularly in your office. And how do you make sure that everyone feels like an equal partner in work, and that you're setting everyone up for success, instead of creating an environment where only the people who are in the office can succeed? So one of the strategies that we've seen work really well is you got to have technology that can connect you regardless of location. Now, this may not seem profound on its own, but if you design your technology stack in the way that your teams communicate to be just as productive for people who are not in your office by default, you'll end up making something which is really great for the people who are in your office. And so there's a lot of pressure over the last year to make your office as enticing as possible, and you should definitely do that. But that's not your starting point. Your starting point is to make sure that your people have what they need to work with each other, and that's not going to be the office every day anymore. And so if you start with systems that do not require the office to work, be it digital whiteboards, most companies by now have discovered either Slack or Teams and invested heavily in moving culture to that, you'll set yourself up for a much more flexible workplace, because it does not require you physically show up somewhere in order to use it. And of course, you can extend it into your existing office locations going forward. And so start by optimizing for people who aren't going to be in the office, and then you can bring it back into the office once you've made that successful. So one of the other casualties of flexible work, if you're not mindful, is communication in general. And we've seen that as more of work becomes distributed, or at least no longer follows the same routine, it can be slower for people to build relationships with one another. And worse, the challenge becomes it's a lot easier to be misinterpreted when you're working in multiple locations and you don't have the nuance of face-to-face communication. And 91% of folks agree with this. And so when you get this wrong, you'll end up with folks that don't feel like the workplace they're being asked to participate in is for them or built for them. And this is a real challenge, both from talent acquisition as well as retention, as you all well know. So how do you give people that sense of purpose that can make sure that when they're working with their colleagues, they're able to have meaningful communication and connection? So we ran a few experiments on this. For context, we run offices for about a couple thousand companies globally, tens of thousands of offices globally as well. And what we found is the number one thing that you can do is to give people shared meaning, purpose for going into the office. A lot of people will try to set up mandates. Don't do that. Don't do mandates. They don't work. They actually have the opposite effect, and they discourage people from engaging as directly because it creates a situation where they're showing up to the office first and then deciding what to do after they arrive. And so the main thing to keep in mind is what makes successful hybrid work is not bringing people into the office. It's bringing the right work back into the office, or shared purpose back into the office. And so one of the things that our product does, by way of example, is allows you to share announcements internally with people who will be in the office, and allows you to opt into shared kind of like on-site events. And what we found is when you actually provide people a shared context, shared purpose for going into the office, and it can be as silly as a dogs in office day. Everyone loves those. You're more likely to inspire regular on-site visitors, which is pretty cool. And so if you can give people a reason to bring their work or them into the office for the day, or a purpose to be in the office, you're more likely to see a routine develop out of that. And so remember, bring the work into the office and the people will follow. So the other thing that we've noticed a lot of people struggle with is, how do you actually measure this whole hybrid work success thing from a business perspective? And as we've already talked about, the wrong way of doing that in our observation is to judge it based on how often the average person visits the office. And the reason for that is everybody's job is slightly different, and sometimes the office is not the best place to do that work. But if you can figure out what work your people do need to do that their other parts of the workplace, like home, Starbucks, whatever, wherever they're choosing to work that's not the office, if you can find the things that are really hard to do there and make the office really good at that, boy, you have something else. And I see a question just came in. How are you defining the term hybrid work? And that's a great question. I'm defining hybrid work as any workplace environment where people will have a mix of in-office and out-of-office work environments. And so for most folks, you can think of that as like 2 to 3 days in the office a week. That's on average what we've seen globally. But there are certainly, it's just as much hybrid work if you have people who are in the office once a month, or even 1 or 2 days a quarter. I know a lot of folks have started hiring remotely or further out driving distance during the pandemic, and they'll maybe bring people in once a quarter to kind of do a few days on site. That's also hybrid work. Hybrid work is, again, just the idea that the office is no longer the center of the workplace, but it is an important part of the story. The cadence and the routine and the schedule, it can vary. So the reason why hybrid in general is so important right now is because, it is becoming such of a norm that it is no longer viewed as a perk. And so if you're trying to make sure that you have the best folks and make sure that you're supporting them as best you can, it's really important that you not just say we provide occasional work from home. It's your workplace is designed around a hybrid workplace strategy or a flexible workplace strategy. And a big part of that requires you be able to give your average employee more agency over how and when to use the office in their average work. And certainly there are some jobs like on-site security, for example, which kind of require you to be in the office a lot. But for many knowledge workers, that's no longer the case. And when you get it right, job performance and turnover both improve. So let's take a slightly different angle, and that's on ownership. So here's a new poll for you. So at this point in your hybrid journey, you've probably formed a committee, a department, who knows, but someone's probably spearheading this initiative. I'd love to learn who they are. So is there a department, an individual in your organization that's responsible for this whole rollout? Who are they? And if you're still figuring that out, that's totally normal. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so we get this question a lot. Who should own your workplace strategy? And when we say workplace, I want to clarify, I don't just mean office. Nowadays, a workplace is anywhere that you work. And yes, that includes the office. It's an important part of that story, but your workplace is bigger than just your offices now. It includes the coffee shops, the home offices, the living room tables that everyone has. And so a workplace, every company has one, and it spans all of those things. And so for the people who are responsible for the strategy behind the workplace, well, guess what? You got a big responsibility there. And it's more important than ever that you have the support internally and the buy-in from the stakeholders that allow you to do that well. And yes, HR is a key part of that story. So if you are starting from scratch, we would say the best group to own your workplace strategy is a workplace team. And this doesn't replace anybody's role. It is a cross-functional team, committee, whatever business unit that brings together leaders or contributors from facilities backgrounds, from IT backgrounds, and from people operations, HR, you name it. The place, the technology, and the people, those three things together make up your workplace experience. And so when you see folks come together in those initiatives, things go really well. And about 15 to 20% of at least our customers have actually formalized a business unit around this workplace department in some cases. And we would suspect that that's going to be a lot more common over the coming years. And again, it's not replacing the importance in individual functions there, but it is uniting three groups which all have, in this way, a shared goal. And so if you're working in an organization where you have an IT department or a facilities department that you aren't quite sure who can work with you on this stuff, well, it's a great time to get introduced. Because when all three of you are working in lockstep, you can increase the likelihood that the office part of your workplace becomes a meaningful contribution to overall productivity and company culture. And it's a lot easier to solve problems when you're working with all aspects of your workplace experience instead of just the one that you have agency over. Okay. So we've seen that there's good news on this front too, and that is that this isn't just some fringe idea of starting to work cross-functionally for your workplace, to improve your workplace experience. 98% of senior level professionals agree that workplace experience will be an industry recognized function in 2 to 3 years. Maybe you've already hired one of these, a workplace experience coordinator, a director of workplace. These titles are becoming more common. And this is the sort of thing which, if you're going through that challenge of who actually owns this thing, if work is not just happening in the office anymore, well, having a dedicated workplace role might be a good step in coordinating the necessary changes over the coming years. Because here's the thing about hybrid, it's not a set it and forget it event. You're going to have to watch, monitor, and iterate on a weekly, monthly basis as the work that your people need to do evolves. And some of that work will have a place in the office, but a lot of it won't, and that's okay. But best thing you can do is make sure that you have the support network, the skills, the expertise, and then the feedback loops necessary to know if you're successful in supporting your people's work, and ultimately make a great company and a culture that everyone is proud to work with and on. So we've done a fair amount of additional research, numbers, charts, all of the stuff that if you really love this sort of stuff, some tactical advice as well. We've put it together in a PDF where all good information goes. So this will be provided as part of today's presentation, but we'd strongly recommend, if you're at all uncertain, if you're on the right track, all of that, take a look at that, and happy to help if you think we might be able to. So with that, I think we'll do some open-ended Q&A here. And I see a number of questions have come in while I've been speaking. And it doesn't have to be a question about just the topics we talked about. Yeah, let's hear them. Where would we like to begin? Okay.
All right, and just as a reminder, to submit a question, please use the Q&A panel located at the bottom right side of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send. Please keep the drop-down as all panelists. All right. Our first question is, what do workplace experience teams need to better engage hybrid employees?
Could you repeat that? I feel like there was a verb missing.
Sure. What do workplace experience teams need to better engage hybrid employees?
Oh, okay. Yes, needs. Okay, so I'll field that. It's a great question because, as you all know, if you don't have the backing and the resources needed to actually do something well, that's doomed from day one. So there needs to be consensus between stakeholders in those three key areas: places, whoever owns the location, the people, the place side of it. That can be your corporate real estate or your facilities teams, whoever kind of decides, like, hey, when you show up to that office, who's responsible for the bricks, that area. You need alignment between them, IT typically, technology, and people, that you're going to work together on this, or that you're going to empower the people, like a workplace role, to make decisions that require your help. Because if you don't have that, it's going to constantly be a battle of figuring out the best possible solution you can get while only involving a technology and a people team, because facilities is too busy on other stuff. And it's really hard because these are three groups that haven't had a whole lot of time to collaborate over, the last decade or two, and not really. And so the last 2 years, there's learning in many ways how to do that. But if they can agree that there's a benefit to doing that, that's step one. And then the other one is that your senior leadership, especially, ideally your CEO, has to believe that the next 10 years of workplace is going to look different than the last 10. And if they don't, that's the first thing you need to fix. Because if you're trying to maintain status quo there, you're not really going to succeed with a workplace team. So, all right.
All right, great, thank you.
Yep.
Our next question is, how does the work from anywhere affect legal areas?
Oh, I made it to one question in before the lawyers arrived. No, I'm kidding. But we work with a lot of law firms, and it are we working? Sorry. Was that question more from like from a legal perspective, or from like the legal as an industry? Just to clarify, like, are we asking how?
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm not
sorry,
sure exactly how. If you can clarify your question, that would we'd be able to elaborate further. Thank you.
Go. And while we're doing that, maybe the next question we can get ahead of that.
Okay. The next question is, how do we manage team meetings in a hybrid environment to make the team fully engaged?
Okay. One of the things that we've seen work really well, and I'll just give you one piece of tactical advice, and it's not going to work 100% of the time, but I promise you it will have an impact. If you have one person in the TV or remote meeting with people who are physically in the same space, consider splitting up the people who are in the space too. If one person is remote, everybody calls in from their desk, or have the presenter always be presenting from their own machine. And this goes, I'll give you a great example that we've seen play out across a bunch of companies. If you have a hybrid workforce, the odds are there's going to be some people in the audience who aren't with you in office. If you are doing, let's say, an all hands town hall, you name it. And it can be really easy if you, as one of those remote people, to feel like you're just a member of the audience and not really the target audience. If the presenter and there's a bunch of people clearly visible on screen, right? And you're just there watching through the glass. And so what you can do is you can actually have your presenters go to a separate room from everybody else and present from that room. And what that does is it puts everyone on equal footing, and it gives the people who are in the office the opportunity to see the same exact thing as the people who are remote. And I know that might sound silly, but it has a profound impact on signaling, yes, we support people who just didn't make the office part of their day-to-day, but we also don't want to create an environment where the only way that you can feel seen, heard, or productive is by physically showing up to the office. So split meetings between hybrid or between remote and in person, and try to have an equitable presentation philosophy, ideally with your own presentation room.
Perfect. And we did get clarification for the other question. The clarification is not legal industry, legal issues related to work in general, like issues with workers' comp or when staff do work from home and from other states.
Yeah, so the other state one, I think, is probably, I won't pretend to have an interesting or useful opinion on some of those things, but the one that I have seen a few examples of, which are compelling, is on the multiple state thing. And even other countries. And so there's a few examples out there, like from Airbnb and Pinterest actually too, where they've had to develop programs which basically allow folks to work from any state, or even if they choose to go to other countries, they can do that too. Now, if you're hearing that and saying, oh, well, we're not, operating at that scale, we can't do that, two things might change your mind. In the case of Airbnb, they have a thing where as long as it's under, I think, like 3 to 4 weeks, you can go and work anywhere at a time, and it's well within legal bounds. So, for example, if you are going to go remote, work from Canada for a few weeks, generally speaking, not Canada, let's keep it domestic, keep it simple, like Florida, right? You're going to Florida, A-okay. But what they've done by doing that is also indicate that if you're going to stay in those areas longer, you got to talk to us. And so if you remain silent on the issue all up, you're more likely to encounter those situations later where you have the messy, this person's been in Florida for like 3 months and we're not legally allowed to, we're not registered there, we can't, we don't have workers' comp, whatever it is. But if you can set the boundaries as we know you're going to travel, okay, you can at least make sure that you're endorsing the right behavior instead of remaining silent, which comes with more risk. The other thing that you might not be aware of, but is a big thing, is digital nomad visas. Over 70 countries actually have developed these over the last few years, especially. And basically, they are visas that are intentionally designed to be for people who are working remotely and just want to do it from a given country. And these are visas that, depending on your industry, depending on the work, remove a lot of the risk that you might be traditionally associating with, international employment, et cetera. Obviously, if you want to move there full-time, different story, but digital nomad visas are a thing. Google them, and I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised at how accommodating they are for travel.
Great, thank you. And our next question is, what are your thoughts on tracking success from an employer perspective, staff productivity in office versus at home?
So I think in general, there have been a number of high-profile situations where employees do not respond positively to environments where you're monitoring for the purpose of, like, are you doing your job? Where I have seen that sort of stuff go well is if you look at it more from the lens of onboarding. So one of the big challenges, especially of the current work environment, is if you hire people who are new, let's say, to a job or to starting their career for the first time, like new graduates. A lot of the way that they learned how to work and even the professional environment the barrier is a lot higher now because they don't get to absorb the passive sort of conversations and nuances of their coworkers unless they're in the office. And so one way that you might think about that is if you start not by trying to do a broad strokes productivity program where you're like, how do we make sure that these folks are actually working when they are at home and not just on YouTube all day, but instead look at, like, hey, when we bring new hires on board, how equipped are they after 6 weeks, after 8 weeks in a hybrid work environment? Is there a skill difference there? If so, what can we do to make sure that that's more successful? And I think you'll find that many of the things that improve that will also benefit your larger group. But I will say performance management in general is one of those things in a hybrid environment, which is tougher. And it's going to require you to develop a system which works without proximity-based supervision by default.
Great, thank you. And this one's kind of similar, but maybe if you have a little bit more input. What tools are companies using to track performance now?
So I wouldn't endorse this necessarily, but you might look at things like Microsoft has Viva, which is a workplace analytics tool. And if you use, for example, Outlook, it can tell you if people are reading their emails while also in a meeting. If that's the sort of productivity metrics that you're looking at, there are tools available to you for that. I would say in the same breath, that probably is not going to solve the problem in the way that you want it. And you will probably notice that you will get a lot better results by focusing on how to enable and train your managers to manage teams that they are not physically in the same location as, because those are ultimately going to be the people accountable for a lot of those performance management discussions, and it's a lot higher leverage than having to do a broad strokes surveillance or monitoring system.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question is, how do you push back on the idea that work can only be done in person, or those working remotely may be slacking off?
Okay. Has your business gone out of business in the last 2 years? If not, guess what? On some level, it's possible to function with people working from home. So if you've made it this far, you got some good early signs. And you might feel like the workplace pre-pandemic was a lot easier and more predictable, and that's true. But I think the reality of it is you are going to find it increasingly more and more challenging to build the sort of workforce that you need to stay competitive and also attract and retain the right folks if you take a position that work can only happen in the place where I have to be able to see the work in order to know that it's happening. And if you need a good maybe parallel, it's in many ways, it's similar to when software moved from being a thing that's in a server closet behind you, installed with a CD-ROM, to the cloud. I think there's certain stuff that you don't need to have physically with you to know that it's working. And that's, I guess another quick tip there would just be, if you have more than one office location, you'll find that people's attitudes towards folks working in like the London office, no argument could be made about somebody who's working from home. Oh, well, we have to be in the same place to like actually be productive. That couldn't also be made about somebody who's in an office, just not yours. So I think a lot of folks, they haven't really dealt with that dissonance yet, and you're gonna lose some people if you don't.
All right, great, thank you. And we have a follow-up from that question, comment question from the previous question. What about those employees who prefer to meet in person as they feel more connected than joining the session from their office just to make the remote workers feel equal? Would you recommend specific training for managers and employees to work in a hybrid place?
I think it's a judgment call at a certain point. And look, like the team has to decide. Ultimately, I think that you're going to have conversations with your managers about like ways of making sure that they are, Google calls it like digital equity, like incorporating that sort of digital flexible work equity in the workplace. And so if you are hiring folks that cannot be in the office every day, and you are putting them in a position where they are going to have a experience which is less than their coworkers, that's going to be something that even if you can't change it, you're going to want to be mindful of. And look, I get it. Not every meeting, if you have 8 people in the office and one person's like commuting to the airport, exceptions, of course. But in general, the gesture matters. And I think just making that part of the conversation is progress in and of itself. You don't have to nail it 100% of the time.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how does hybrid work in manufacturing operations?
Differently, for sure. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, there's certain types of work that does require a certain support by the location itself. And so if you think about hybrid work as the main goal, again, being bringing the right work to the office, manufacturing in many cases where you have these large CNC machines or whatever, right? Some of that stuff you can't exactly set up in your living room, obviously. So that work obviously has to happen in a very specific location, but there's probably other work, like if you have an accounting department, et cetera, that might function differently. And this is the thing that can be challenging at first to kind of get right, because people have different jobs. And by proxy of that, it might have different requirements of how much office is needed to do that job. And so your accounting department may be able to be remote 4 days a week, whereas you might have line workers that can't. And, that's definitely, I think, a challenge that how to communicate that. But I would say focus on what work can be done in the office first, or has to be done first in the office. And I think that can inform your strategy from there.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how do you recommend fostering water cooler conversation, team building, and engagement amongst team members in a hybrid environment?
So, simple one that is really easy, especially if you use group chat like Teams or Slack, is there's tools like we use Donut. It's spelled D-O-N-U-T. And basically what it does is every week it randomly selects 2 people and introduces them. And what this does is it allows those folks to actually talk to each other and to have a reason to kind of like just have coffee that week. And that can be digital coffee, in-person coffee, but these are the little sort of simple things that can have a big impact too. If you have a growing distribution of employees throughout the country, you might also consider having a quarterly on-site in your office where you get a hotel block, bring everyone in town, etc. And those are, people look forward to those. And we've seen that play really successfully in multiple industries as well, especially when millennials and Gen Z are involved, as you might expect.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what are some of the most successful hybrid setups you've seen? For example, free reign to come in and go as they please, set team days in office, set 3 days in, 2 days work from home.
So a successful hybrid work rhythm, cadence, whatever you'd like to call it, is one that the team agrees on. And so it helps, like if you have a engineering team, which is doing 90% of the work together, and they agree, hey, we want to do this part of our job together in person. We think that like this team meeting that we have every other week for sprint reviews, whatever you want to call it, if we do that in person, that's something that we think builds team and makes communication clearer. That's a good rhythm for them. Maybe the rest, they stay home 9 days out of 10 and they come in only for that. And that can be totally fine if the team agrees that that's the right one. But if you don't have those conversations and you're not inspiring your managers to have those conversations, resentment builds. Resentment, again, is unmet expectations over time. So if you have one person who expects, I'm in the office, why aren't other people? That's where you get trouble. And so the problem with mandates at the top level is that you have people who are deciding how you're supposed to work, but you might be thinking, this is not actually supporting my work. They don't like it, and they can grow resentment if the expectation is it's more important that you're here than that you are in the best place to do your work. And so just the teams, department, functional teams, whatever, that's where the norms come from, generally, successfully.
Great, thank you. Our next question, could a manager ask the person who is working from home and only that person to provide a list of what they are working on?
You could do that. I guess my follow-up question would just be, what does a right answer look like? Is it one that indicates that they've been working from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. with reasonable lunch breaks? Or on the flip side, is it that they completed the most important task that they needed to that day. And I think one of the things that is an intangible that we've seen from people who are able to decide kind of like, is the office part of my day or not? It's when they're working from home, the hours may be slightly different. And you might see that people are maybe bringing their kids to school and starting a little bit later because they don't have a commute, but actually you see them coming back online for an hour or two after their kids go to bed. And that's not a sort of environment that if you only relied on office work, you'd get. And look, like, you don't have to glamorize like working late, but people are more able to split the work across a larger time frame. And so the way that success can be measured in that environment may challenge the way that it might look in an office. And so before I'd ask that question, I'd be very careful to make sure that I have a good definition of what a good answer looks like.
Great, thank you. Our next question, what are some good resources for training managers to manage remotely? Our organization is on board with remote hybrid work, but the management environment is new and we'd like to prepare. If you don't want to recommend a source, what topics should we address?
So this is if we talk about skills and that organizations and the industries in general will have to build over the next 2 to 3 years, this is probably in the top 3. So there are certain industries where you'll have an easier time hiring people who are managers that have been fully remote. And that, just having one of those in your organization can help build skills within your management layers. So I would consider, as like a tactical advice, there are certainly webinar programs, all of that, if you search out there. But if you consider adding specific requirements or soliciting specifically on remote job boards for people with years of management experience, you'll find that they exist out there, and you can learn from their last decade or so of experience in the field, albeit not in a fully hybrid environment, but generally they have a strong understanding, remote workers as managers, of how to treat other folks in similar situations.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Let's see. What have you found companies are paying for expense-wise as it relates to home office equipment, desk, chairs, laptop, internet, etc.?
Yeah, so I would in general say the simplest version that we've seen work well is the same one that we've actually started employing ourselves here internally. Because originally you might think, hey, we'll subsidize everyone's internet because that just helps them do their work. But what we found is if you're less opinionated on that and you move some of, let's say, the budget that you would normally allocate towards like in-office perks, like snacks or whatever, to a general like hybrid stipend almost, like where every month you might add like a 150, whatever, it can be a small amount, dollar stipend, hybrid stipend, to as a perk, you'll see a couple things happen. One, people might choose to invest that 1 month in like, getting a new chair, monitor, whatever. You can leave it up to them. But another thing that by designating it a hybrid stipend, they can actually also allocate it towards things like commuter passes or train like rail passes, things like that allow them to get to the office more easily too, like parking. So I would consider lumping all of that together, because if you just make it like a work from home stipend, you're going to get people focusing on stuff that only benefits that aspect. But if you make it a hybrid stipend, it also carries to things that make their commute and travel and increase the odds that they go to the office a lot more too.
Great, thank you. And I think this last question here is a really good ending. Are there, are there future of work networks or forums that you can recommend? I'm looking for networks, people to connect and expand conversations on workplace experience, hybrid, evolution of work from home. Thanks.
There are a lot. And look, I promise you we didn't plant this question, but we have an event in October we'd love to have you at. And we'll share some information about that in the follow-up materials, but we're bringing together workplace leaders from across the country and world for exactly that purpose. Because it's true, it is very challenging to find other people in the trenches willing to talk about it right now. And that's a shame. And we're happy to be part of, hopefully, a solution to that. Beyond that, future of work is a term that a lot of people have used for many years and can be very hard to wade through. I get it. But a lot of the conversations that have been happening in remote work communities for the last decade are really relevant, and I would consider also looking at those. Did we do it? Is that everybody?
Great, thank you. I think there is one more question. How do you advocate for remote or hybrid work when some positions cannot be performed remote or hybrid? Leadership responds to the idea of what if the person that can't perform their job wants to work remote? What do we tell them? I say that not all jobs have the same requirements. If they want to work remote, they should evaluate if the job they are doing fits their needs and wants.
I think that that's a great response. And I think that the number one thing that I think sounds like your response would also inspire as a follow-up is, hey, is there a disagreement that the work can or can't be done remotely? Because in those situations, again, like if you had somebody who was a front desk security, and they believe that they can do their work remotely and you don't, make sure that you both agree. But I think in those cases, if they can't do their work remotely, I think that there's maybe a career change in their future. But if they disagree, well, hey, maybe they have an idea you haven't thought of. Could happen. But I'd start there. But it sounds like you have the right answer. Okay, cool. Well, hey, thank you, everybody, for letting me be part of your day. Really good questions. And certainly we'd love to sort of hear from you if you think that we might be able to help you in your hybrid journey at all. But otherwise, thank you. I hope you have a great day.